Um, my apologies for being slightly late. I will explain as I go. This time yesterday, I was sitting in a bar in a fancy hotel in Miami, surrounded by some very beautiful people. Take away the sunshine and the drink, couldn't tell the difference, to be honest. So thank you very much for having me here. I'm a bit rushed, so I'm going to try and just calm myself down as I go. I'm here to spend the next 45 minutes telling you about how we at Cognizant see the future, obviously with the lens of mobility. The two sort of warnings I'll give you up front. One, that obviously I'm a little bit jet lagged, so if you see me slowing down in the middle, I will hopefully correct it by the fact that I tend to speak very fast when I get excited. So hopefully those two will balance themselves out. Briefly, what I'll do is I'll just talk about these three things: how we see mobility, how we understand the past and the present, and therefore how we see the future of work and play. I do have to start with an obligatory slide about Cognizant. I've joined Cognizant 3 months ago, so anything I say here is more in admiration than in any kind of hubris. None of this is in any way sort of down to me, but Cognizant's success story is well charted in the market. It's a publicly traded company. It's grown from nothing to 6 billion in about 16, 17 years. We are now in the Fortune 500 as of this year. We will close this year at about just over $6 billion US, which is not bad considering we were about half the size in 2008. So that kind of tells you in the tough economic climate that we've done quite well. We are now 130,000 people strong. So I was running my own consulting company before I joined Cognizant. So I went from a one-person organization to a 130-person organization. I'm still getting my head around it. We have 720 customers, etc., etc. I don't have to bore you with any more detail. But for the fact that this is an IT services company, most of our clients are enterprise clients. We do a lot of heavy lifting around technology, obviously IT, as well as a lot of other non-IT technology that has now become part and parcel of our work. So on to mobility then. I run the mobility practice for Cognizant for UK and Europe. So a lot of what I say is obviously influenced by our immediate market, but hopefully I'll be able to draw on our experiences in other parts of the world as well. And in the first part, I'll go very quickly through what you might consider very basic things, but it's always good to just set the stage. So we think mobility, the way it is understood today, is a combination of this independence as well as awareness. And I always I like to start by saying that when people say money doesn't matter, most people who say that usually have a lot of it. So when you want to be independent of something, it usually means that you have to really be quite good at it. So when we talk about mobility being location independent, which means you should be able to get your information, content, services anywhere, it typically means that you have to be extremely locationally aware, because A, it has to find you, and B, it should be able to contextualize whatever it's presenting to you with respect to your location. We, of course, run the risk of narrowing ourselves too much around mobile phones and iPads and iPhones, but obviously it's not about that. There's a whole broader world of mobility that goes into many other devices, from healthcare to energy to lots of machine-to-machine kind of environments coming down the pipe. So therefore it means we need to be device independent. Consequently, we need to be very device aware. That means, unlike the web, where we've been sort of spoiled by the fact that it's a browser, it'll always work in the browser, and you don't have to worry about much else. We suddenly are back in a world where we do have to worry about the network, the device, the capability of the screen, all kinds of things. So, and therefore we also have to be network independent, which means we might be working on a private or public network, we might be on IP or GSM network, we might need to be on a broadband or dial-up, and you know what's coming. So we need to therefore be very network aware. Sometimes that leads to things like adaptive streaming if you're delivering media. It might lead to an ability to move seamlessly between networks if you're delivering any kind of continuous service. But mobility is also recovery of lost time, right? That's the whole point, this whole anywhere, anytime paradigm. I read that the average commute time in the UK is 54 minutes. That, of course, is not the London subway, but there is this, however you slice and cut that, there is this sump of time that we are hopefully now able to recover. It's a moot point whether you want to spend that time at work or at play, but the fact is that you can use that time. And enough number of studies have been done. Motorola have identified a number of 42 minutes per employee I think that's on a weekly basis saved. So I'm sure we can quibble about the numbers, but the fact is that there is certainly an efficiency metric that is being, or a button that's being pushed there. I'd like to talk about the elevator actually in this case as well, because although the elevator was around from sort of I think 1850 onwards, it is also true that the skyscrapers that we saw in the mid 20th century owed their presence to elevators, because without them they would have been fire hazards. So you couldn't have those 120-storied buildings without the elevator, and you wouldn't have the giant corporations, the GEs of the world and the GMs of the world in the way that they were created, if you could not, in those days, in sort of, we're talking mid 20th century, with the existing communication infrastructure, you wouldn't be able to create the large global companies, or at least, if not global, significantly large companies, without co-locating people. And it was only possible to co-locate people in such large high-rise buildings. So there is this link between the elevator and the creation of large companies, because without one you may not have had the other. In much the same way, I think there is a underlying linkage between mobility and the globalized company that we see today. So obviously, I'm perhaps over elaborating a very simple point, which is that without a fundamental grasp and control over the kind of mobility related technologies and tools that we have at our disposal, it would not be possible for us to create the kind of dispersed global companies and operations that we have today. And probably what is worth underlining is that you no longer have to be a very large enterprise corporate type of company. You can be a small 10% company, you can still be global because of the way mobility works at this point of time. Obviously that means that we are now able to reach all kinds of stakeholders. The B2C aspect, reaching customers, has obviously been the focus point, but other focal points could include in future better investor relations and all kinds of partners. So I think what the point we've got to today is therefore that mobility is no longer a separate piece. It is actually just a feature that you can add to pretty much anything, whether it's mobility as a part of television, as a part of retail and commerce, as a part of transaction and payments, or even traveling or cricket or any sport that you can think of. We know that the growth rate of all those contexts and usage has been quite dramatic. We've talked about 15 billion downloads as opposed to sort of double the time for the same number of downloads in the iTunes and sort of music download world, which we thought was quite good to start with, but we've doubled the rate of adoption in the case of apps. And a sort of, again, a very fundamental and perhaps very obvious point is that underlying all of this is that mobility engenders relationships. It allows us to be in professional or personal relationships over much greater distances, and therefore the way our lives shape up today is fundamentally different because of mobility. We know it's everywhere. We know that this kind of chart will always be outdated, and I'm sorry that it's not very legible, but you can see what I'm trying to establish here, that pretty much anywhere you look in the world, there is a significant mobile population, when I say mobile phone population, and the split between Android versus iPhones might vary across that audience across the world, depending on which part of the world you are. Obviously, in the West, you have a much greater dominance of iOS, iPhone type devices, and you might still find a strong presence of Symbian in some of the developing world. China has a 42% number there that may have changed since that chart was created maybe about 3 or 4 months ago. We see the world of mobility as in sort of 3 very simple chunks, and this I guess I'm referring a little bit more to enterprise mobility here. The first bit is enabling. So in the enabling world, all we're doing is we're saying you could deliver a service to a desktop, and now we can deliver it to a mobile phone. Effectively, all we're doing is recasting a service into a different screen, a different form factor, and a different user context. But we're not fundamentally changing anything. In the second stage, we are actually starting to transform processes. And we see some of our clients starting to do this quite significantly now. Because the mobile device that, as we know it, which is the mobile phone or the iPad, comes with so many intrinsic capabilities out of the box, it's possible to start looking at the same business process and ask ourselves the question, with all of this capability, can we actually fundamentally change the way our processes perform? A good example of that is one of our clients asked us this, they called us in and shared with us their vision of the world that they saw, and they had actually detailed out a lot of things about how they saw their employees function in a 5-year time span. One of the things they had identified was that the company was in the travel and hospitality area, so there's a lot of equipment that often needs repair. And they said if our frontline employees can have mobile devices, they can actually identify things that need repair and fill in a form there and then on the device, or trigger a request for repair. But we said, well, what about the fact that you can actually take a photograph of what is actually broken? Because then the service person could potentially evaluate whether he needs to or she needs to bring tools to the location, or whether the item needs to be shifted back to a factory, and you can potentially cut the mean time to repair, which obviously amounts to some pounds saved. So this kind of, looking at a process and saying, can we do it differently, not just can we do it on a mobile phone, is an important part of the transformative process that we see coming down. And then at the third level, we start to envision, where we say, can we create entirely new revenues? Can we create entirely new business models thanks to the technologies? Most of these obviously are not born out of large enterprises, but that is almost a feature of technology. So I'm sure we will see some examples of large organizations trying to create new value, but the examples I have here are obviously all startups. And I'm sure you're familiar with most of these companies and the kind of exponential growth we've seen in their funding and their usage. We know that it's ubiquitous. This is no longer, it's coming and someday this will all happen. We know that we are already in a world where this incredible amount of usage has pretty much taken over everything we do. And you'll get any number of predictions. I have a few that I'll share with you. But suffice it to say that it is here and now. It's all around us. It's always worth asking the question, so in all of this, where's the money? And this is a Forrester report that says that if you're here today in 2011, obviously the pie itself grows significantly over the next 5 years. But they've broken it up into building initial applications, which in today's world is the larger part of the pie. But increasingly, that gets superseded by reinventing business processes and back-end systems that will support the app-based world. And in the middle, of course, there's the whole challenge of managing not just a single app, but typically a large company will have a portfolio of apps. Some of them will be client-facing or customer-facing, some will be internal. So the ongoing life cycle and maintenance of those is the other bit. So that's where these guys see the money in this business. Of course, in the B2C world, we already know that there are all these different models at play. The in-app, the gamification, the freemium models. These are probably all known to you, and we have some examples, obviously, of each of these. So the Cognizant view of this is that in the world that we're going to be in, let's say in 5-6 years' time, mobility will be the preferred computing platform. What we do on a PC today, we will do on mobile devices. That's not to say that we will all switch to iPhones at work. There are significant intermediary steps, and it's very hard to envision what that will look like. What I would personally certainly project is that I don't think we would be in a world where we're all using iPhones on our desk. But in some form, in some different way, we will use these technologies, and sort of in the IT world, the Java and .NET kind of work that occupies a large part of what companies do will become iOS and Android work, and companies will run a much larger part of their enterprise systems with a view to mobility, and that will become much more central to the organization. We have some data that tells us that we've already got a scenario where smartphone and tablet sales is already sort of inching ahead at this point of time, but projected to double PC and laptop sales. But this is influenced by consumer spending as well, so that may not give you the complete picture with respect to what's happening inside organizations. And the last part of this section, I just want to say, obviously, in all of this, there's the concept of desire, because we see the tipping point for most organizations is when the CEO or the senior management gets the iPad for Christmas. And that's when a lot of organizations sort of come back and say, well, this is great, this is a great tool, and what do we do with this? And that's probably being unfair to a significant number of our clients and companies out there who are a lot more prescient, who have already thought this through and are building significant investment plans for making optimal use of this. For example, we see the early stages of investment in Salesforce automation, because that's obviously the part of the business where the most number of people are already mobile, and they need the support to be able to, if you're out in the field presenting to a client, be it in pharma, be it in financial services, you want to, at your fingertips, be able to get all the stuff that you need to convince a client, whether it's a brochure or costing or pricing or product information. So that's the quick and dirty view of mobility, the way we see that. If you look at the past and the present, of course, is just the sort of, using a calculus analogy, it's just the limit of the past. It's clear that there is a trend towards computing becoming smaller and smaller. And maybe it's worth venturing a guess that even without Steve Jobs' intervention, somebody would have said, you know what, let's take this form factor, let's make it a little smaller, let's stick a SIM into it, and let's make it a device that can actually work on multiple networks. It may not have been as cool as an iPad, and it may not have happened as quickly, but maybe in another few years we would have gotten somewhere in that region anyway. So this was a trend that was always going to happen. We know that there's been this, you're probably all familiar with this, so I'm not going to read any part of this slide, but it's worth pointing out that, what to me is fascinating is that in this whole cycle, the first iPhone was obviously in 2007, so we're now, 4 years from that point. If we talk about 2015, that's approximately the same amount of time. So the amount of change we've seen in our personal and professional work and experience using devices born off the iPhone, that means the entire Android phone family, the iPhones, the iPads, that change is quite tidal, and it would be very hard to project what would happen in the next 4 years, because we should rationally expect that there would be a few more game-changing products, services that would come about. Sorry, I don't know why that jumped. We are, of course, in the world of mobile payments, and that is something that we should certainly keep an eye on, and we'll come back to that. What's interesting is that, if you look at the present, I'm quick show of hands if you've heard of the Tesco experience in South Korea, where they use the augmented reality model on the railway tube line. Has everyone heard of that? Okay, not enough of you, fortunately, so I'll tell you the story very quickly. So Tesco in South Korea did some research, and they discovered that a large number of their consumers shopped on their way back from home, and obviously were very time poor. So what they did was they basically painted on a railway station, like a tube station or equivalent, an entire aisle of their shop. So you could actually see all the products, but pictures of all the products. But what you could do is you could take your smartphone and scan those pictures, and using augmented reality type technologies, essentially you could create a shopping list and submit it, and Tesco would deliver it to your home within the hour. So you're really creating an extremely visual, almost touch and feel kind of shopping experience. But it's not, what I especially like about this is that it's not born out of a pie in the sky thinking. They actually did the homework and found out the behavior that they could enhance. And that's a great example of bringing together the technology bit, the vision bit, as well as some grounded research and understanding of consumer behavior. So that's a brilliant example. We also think there's a lot of scope for creativity, as this will suggest, that it's not just another code and another set of lines or more technology. I think there's an element of design, creativity, vision that goes into a lot of this. So this is a good example of the Ralph Lauren QR codes. eBay have upped their mobile forecast, and they feel that they're going to get a significantly larger chunk of their revenues off the mobile phone. And I'm sure many of you have used the eBay mobile device. We could go on and on in this, but obviously financial services is a space rife for disruption. Every single bank now has their mobile app, and I use the NatWest one. It's pretty good, and I'm sure most of you use some form of mobile banking applications, whether it's a website that is customized for the mobile device or it's an app. Everyone's doing that. But also in the specific area of mobile payments, we see incredible amount of activity. You may have seen that lots of operators have applied for banking licenses across the world, because a number of telecom operators see this space as being potentially up for grabs, and there is certainly a significant possibility that we will see a kind of convergence that we may not have envisioned even 3 or 4 years ago. Media and broadcast is another very obvious area where this has been there's been a big impact of this. This research is interesting because it shows that this behavior of two-screen TV watching, where you're watching TV and you have something else, whether it's an iPhone or an iPad, whether that is being used to do something that is connected to the TV program, or you're just multitasking. For 18 to 24-year-olds, that's 70% of people who have a second screen while watching TV. And for the 45 to 54-year-olds, it's still about 44%. That's not insignificant by any means. And what broadcasters are now doing is they're trying to supplement the television programming by creating a second screen experience that you can follow. So whether it's a game show that you can play along, Million Pound Drop I think is a great example where there was a game that you could play in real time as the TV game was going on. But equally, sports, live shows, political shows, all of them have great potential to sustain a secondary conversation through social networking while you're watching the primary screen. We at Cognizant have envisioned something slightly different, and we thought we could actually go the other way. And this is something that's very much in proof of concept stage, but we're looking to take second screen information and put it back into the primary screen. So classic use case that we're talking about is if you're watching a football match and the commentator says something like, that goal has really silenced the crowd. They're talking about 35,000 people, 50,000 people, whatever, in a stadium. What we'd like to be able to do is to allow the commentator to say, that goal has silenced the Twitter sphere, or this is what's happening in the Twitter sphere or in the social networking area in the context of this game. This team is losing, but the fans are still proud. And be able to pull out those sentiments. So there's a combination of social media and analytics. There's a sentiment analysis that sits on top of that. And then in real time, you should be able to convert that into something like a broadcast graphic that a producer then could push out onto air and say, this is a team X versus team Y, and team X is losing, but the fans are proud, they're angry, they're resentful, whatever it is. And that creates a storyline. And we think that there is a potential to actually influence the storyline, which is quite exciting, and go from the second screen to the primary screen. And there's potentially some value there. On the enterprise side, we've, of course, you'll get any number of figures of this kind. Some kind of almost every solution that is either driven by iPhones or iPads, and we see all the increasing numbers of workforce mobility that is going only in one direction. Just a small point here is that it always amazes me how quickly these numbers get outdated. That 4 billion number, I think this slide may be about the better part of a year old, which is horrible in the context of this industry, but obviously that number is now about 5.3 billion. So we see the kind of rapid change that is taking place. And there's a strong feeling, I think it's worth mentioning, that the great bed of innovation, and this is what probably makes mobility a little bit different from previous waves of technology. One of the ways is that a lot of this innovation is happening in the East. It's happening in places like Korea or Japan or Singapore, and it's coming back to this part of the world, whereas most previous ways of technology have gone the other way. So perhaps there's a need for us to actually look at what's working in some of those parts of the world and bring it back. The other thing that's very different, and of course there's only one person we can thank for this, is that technology historically has been very dry. Technology has not been cool in the past until we had the iPhone, and then suddenly, apart from everything else, this is take this as my opinion and nothing else, but technology now has emotion involved. It is no longer an unemotional and dry subject. When we come to the world of the iPhones, people invest emotion into their device. It's no longer just another work tool or even just another phone. So I think that has blurred dramatically the boundaries between our personal and professional lives. That has led to the whole bring your own device models that companies are now struggling with, consumerization as they call it, of IT, where users bring their personal devices into the workplace and expect to receive work emails on them. And companies are trying to work out strategies, even as we speak, about how to do device management and how to do data protection on devices like that. And of course, in many companies, you've got a layer of employees, senior people who have been given company phones, a layer that is using their own phones that are supported by IT, and a layer that are using their own phones nonetheless, and IT doesn't quite know what to do with them. So there are significant challenges in that space. And just a reminder that none of this, when you look at it from as a consumer, you see the device and it's beautiful, and we all know how attractive it is. But to pull it together, I'm always fascinated by this picture, because this tells you how difficult the supply chain for pulling together something like an iPad is. And if you look at the number of providers that are involved to bring this device to market, to actually control this, to manage this, and to make it as efficient as possible, in fact, so efficient that it has been really impossible for a number of other competitors to actually simply re-engineer this or reverse engineer it and do the same thing, is quite immense. So I think we should not undermine the behind the scenes nitty-gritty hard work that goes into managing the supply chain of products such as the iPhone or iPad. So on to the future then, and I will hopefully, I'll make some departures to just sort of talking about mobility in a narrow sense. But to start with, we have lots and lots of numbers that come out of experts. We know that there is this expectation that the e-commerce will grow from by an order of magnitude approximately. So from 210 billion to 1.4 trillion. That's 7 times. But mobile commerce will grow by an order of magnitude of 2, which is it'll grow 100 times. So it'll become close to a sort of 10% of the overall e-commerce business worldwide. We know that mobile advertising has its own graph, and I know that there's debates are still raging as to how viable it is, what will work and what will not. And we are probably at an early stage of that market, but clearly enough people are putting a lot of money into that, obviously because it is inherently personal, context sensitive, sometimes location sensitive. We know that we've talked about payments and banking, and people are talking about I'll send the slide deck through, and all these are, you can't see the asterisks, and they've all got different research companies that have done this, their number crunching and got to these numbers. So the 10% of users or 13% of users in any economy using mobile banking is or mobile payments is very significant, because you would assume that at that kind of number it is sort of mainstream. If it's certainly early majority. We've talked about m-commerce again. The transaction, and this is where again some of the work we've done at Cognizant is to do with bringing together the real world and the virtual world, because one of the biggest problems that we see in the mobile commerce or e-commerce world is you get one kind of experience when you shop online in terms of your ability to search inventory, compare products. You get a very different experience in the store. You can't go and pick up 5 products and very quickly compare them, because those tools don't exist. So can we bring them together? Could you take a mobile phone into a store and be able to use it in the way that you would do an online comparison? Could you do clever stuff that would not just benefit you, but the store itself? Because typically, if you are a premium customer of a retail store, they don't know who you are until you hit the checkout, because you haven't identified yourself. But if you were in a negotiated manner to identify yourself and be able to, if you're searching for stuff in the shop and if you're using these tools, the store can know that one of our most valued customers is in the store, and we can do something about it. We can make him an offer, we can pay more attention to him or her, and that is a symbiotic relationship, obviously, that we are trying to engender. We've got coupon related stories coming out of our ears this year, so to what extent they will dominate is up for discussion again. The number that in this set of numbers strikes me is really this kind of, if you're talking about the $35 billion sales from apps, and perhaps a deeper look at where those dollars are being spread, there's probably a significant skew, and you might find that the top 10% apps get 80% of the revenues, but that opens up a whole new market. But in future, we also see this market moving from a B2C space to a B2B space. So enterprise apps will be a whole new market that we haven't really explored. So that number could be significantly enhanced by that kind of. But when we talk about the future, one of the biggest problems I feel we face is that it is very difficult to project our thoughts in a non-linear fashion. So the two problems are, none of this happens in a straight line. Each wave of technology influences the next. So you really have an exponential impact, and it is very difficult to think exponentially. We tend to project ourselves a use case, a kind of scenario, kind of experience, and say we could do this better using that technology. What is very hard for us to do is to think we could be doing something completely different. The kind of behaviors that Facebook has enabled, the kind of behaviors that smartphones have enabled, it's not about doing the same things better. It's not about making phone calls better or texting better. It is doing fundamentally different things. Facebook is sort of rendering email obsolete, and so many other behavioral changes that we are seeing. So it's the exponential nature of it, and also the fact that every time you put technology into the hands of users, they do something with it that changes the landscape, and then it either creates a new problem or a new opportunity. So the Zynga opportunity, Zynga doesn't exist without a Facebook in the picture. So that's a new opportunity created by something. You couldn't have conceptualized Zynga without a Facebook in the middle. On the other hand, before we used, in the world where we use feature phones or Nokia phones, we didn't have a battery problem. So sometimes the new technology creates a new problem that we have to solve, and sometimes it's an opportunity. I like this example because received wisdom says you should have a problem and then you should have a solution, and you shouldn't have technology for the sake of technology. However, the iPod Nano, that it uses flash memory, which is different from all the other iPods. And the thing with flash memory is that it was invented in 1967, if I've got this right, by two researchers who discovered a way of creating a memory that would both persist and be rewritable, which was at the time breakthrough. And when they did that, they were asked by their supervisor, so what are you going to do with this? I think this was also in South Korea or Japan, if I'm not mistaken. And they said, we don't know. This is interesting and cool, but we don't know what to do with it. And obviously they were told, that's fine, put it away, go and do some real work. And it stayed in that state till somebody figured out a way to use flash memory in little USB keys and in other formats that would allow us to truly use them more effectively. So now we have flash memory going into pretty much every device we can think of. The way we've identified this sort of change in the future is that we're seeing the whole globalization process being an ongoing and continuing process. We see the emergence of millennials, this category of consumers who use iPhones and Android phones and tablets on Sunday night at home, and then have to walk into office and leave all those behind and use very old world corporate systems, and that challenge there. We see the whole area of virtualization, whether it's virtualization of hardware infrastructure or of software, and moving lots of products into a service model, and obviously the new technology, which is highlighted by cloud computing, but we think that there is this emerging, the master platform, master IT platform, if you will, if you look at it from an enterprise context. These four technologies, social, mobile, analytics, and cloud, in the Cognizant world in our worldview rather, is what will become the underpinning of major corporate systems in the sort of next 5 to 10 years. It's always hard to predict the exact time of the change, but we certainly see this is the direction of it. It's worth pointing out that there is going to be a fundamental and ongoing mobility of workforce across the world. That will vary depending on which part of the world you're looking at. But there is a chicken and egg here. The more we travel away from our families to work, the more we need mobility solutions, and the more these solutions exist, the more confidence it gives us to travel further and further. So that will continue apace, and we see that being a big part of this. I've spoken about behavior changes. Nanotechnology, machine-to-machine, biotech, and social are four almost independent and deeply impactful technologies. But each of them will have an impact on behavior. I forget who it was that said, we shape our buildings and thereafter they shape us. So the way, for example, machine-to-machine might influence architecture, and then how that might influence social behaviors, each of these has this iterative effect on behaviors and then further technology. So this is what really makes predicting the future or planning the future very difficult, because there isn't one future. There are many futures, and you've almost got to invest in options and be able to price them and make sure that you're covered for a number of different eventualities. We're also entering this post-industrial phase where, if you followed the Ken Robinson lectures, his argument about education is quite compelling. He says that all of education that we have today is born out of the Industrial Revolution or the Industrial Age, which means the two fundamental underpinnings of that are batch processing and production line. And so education currently behaves as though it's a batch processing. So roughly an age cohort is assumed to have the same learning capability, and so they're put into a same classroom, and it's production line because you go from one stage to the next. And the argument is that we should now be able to break that open and re-engineer it so that it's not built on those industrial concepts, but individual learning, etc., is sort of becoming a lot more in focus. We're in a post-national world. Plenty of examples will come to mind, but again, my favorite one, and you can see I have a preference for certain sports, is that there was a footballer who played for Italy. His name was Mauro German Camoranesi. The interesting thing was that he was an Argentinian. He didn't know Italian. He didn't know the national anthem. This created a bit of a furor when he was seen on TV not singing the anthem, and then it was discovered that he didn't know the anthem. But examples like that, I think there's been some writing in Britain about, almost importing athletes to compete in the Olympics and then sort of making them English or British. Whichever way you cut that, the fact is national borders are starting to fall away. And business is now increasingly global. The internet obviously is fundamentally global, and that's part of the problem why regulation has become so challenging. And certainly I'm of the belief that we are sort of heading into this post-national world where many parts of our lives are not built around national boundaries. But obviously most governments, most regulatory environments, a lot of industries, broadcasting for example, are built around national boundaries. So there's this push and pull whenever we come up against those borders, and how we address those will be quite interesting going forward. I have a last couple of slides. This one is based out of a book that I would advise all of you to read, especially if you're into very depressing literature, because this is written by a gentleman called Jean-Francois Richard, who I think is the ex-IMF head, and I was at a presentation that he made. And he basically laid out, it was a brilliant presentation, but he laid out the fact that the current financial crisis, big as it is wasn't predictable, but is reasonably solvable. And on a Richter scale of crises, it sort of comes in at a 2 or 3. But what is that, 6, 7, and 8 is things like the environmental crisis, the world population crisis, because in many parts of the world, especially in the Western world, the ratio of working people to non-working people who need to be supported is going to go to about, I think 2:1 in another 20 years. And that becomes economically unsustainable. So there are bigger problems which are more predictable but less easy to solve that are coming down the path. So it is quite likely that as in the next few years, our focus as organizations will also shift to solving global problems which will need a lot more collaborative thinking. So I'm suggesting perhaps a mind shift will take place between the way we run businesses today and the way we run businesses in a few years' time. How many years is, of course, a moot question. And so the way we see this happening is there is this element of, the traditional supply chain model that you see of inbound production. You would normally see it in boxes, and we see this sort of getting dissipated and becoming sort of unchained, if you will, leading to this whole concept of breaking away from industrialization. So I use the school example, but our work, we still work in groups and batches and shifts, 9 to 5, etc. And many companies have already broken away from that. We are breaking away from the whole command and control model of organizations and hopefully solving those post-national and global problems. And so from a Cognizant perspective, we fundamentally think that mobility is the future of work. And that's why sort of all this thinking is going on. And we're working with a number of educational institutions to try and sort of research this a little bit more and see how we can actually make that work. I want to end with a small story because, technology, as lots of people will tell you, is value neutral. It can create both good and bad and sometimes ridiculous. So this story is about a guy who goes into a toilet and he sort of into a stall and he's doing his business and he hears the voice from the next stall saying hi, and he's quite surprised and he says hi. He says the voice says, "What are you doing?" So this guy says, "Same as you." And then the voice says, "Can I come over?" And the guy says, no, that wouldn't be appropriate. And then the voice says, "I'm going to have to hang up and call you back. Some idiot is answering all my questions in the next stall." So I think perhaps the deeper point is that there will be snafus, there will be problems that we'll create. It will not be a smooth ride. There will be lots and lots of areas where technology will fall over. It will create unintended consequences, some positive and some not so positive. But that's the journey I think that we're pretty much set for. And the wheels, as they say, are in motion. I think we are here for a longish and occasionally bumpy ride. But that's pretty much all I had to say on this. Happy to answer any questions if you have time. I don't know if I've overshot my time. Will someone educate me if I've overshot the time? Or if you have a little time, I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have. Oh, perfect. Entirely not by design, I assure you. Yep.
You talked a lot about trends of different bits and pieces. I was wondering where you thought the growth will be in mobile web compared to mobile applications. Do you think you'll see mobile web growing quicker than applications, or the other way around? Or
I think that there's probably a shorter term answer to that is a little bit easier to answer, and that is I think HTML5 is a game changer in that context, because we are seeing a lot of our clients look at HTML5 as a way of bringing the two together, as it were. So you built an HTML5, and then the line between the app and the mobile web starts to not vanish, but certainly get very blurry. But also they see that as a massive way of reducing the expense of the code base, because you no longer have to maintain the Android, the iOS, etc. So in the short term, we think that HTML5 will actually push people to this kind of hybrid model, which is whether you will have mobile web or perhaps a download HTML5 version, which is similar to the mobile web.
But less reliance on the app stores.
That's correct. However, there's always an asterisk on that, and the depends, and I think that's dependent on what your app is trying to do. If the best, I read this somewhere, and it's a good analogy. If you're Financial Times, you have a clientele that knows you and will always want to read your newspaper. So for them, it's very easy to go HTML5 because they are a destination with a steady clientele, and people just need to find an easy way of accessing them. If you're a newsstand magazine that needs to woo consumers with every issue, and therefore needs to have the all singing, all dancing version, maybe then HTML5 is not the best way to go, because then you need perhaps some of the features that a native application can exploit from a device perspective. So I think that's the sort of trade-off. The other bit is that in the long term, as network quality improves, this is the whole PC discussion, right? In the early days, you had the LAN, and the moment you stepped off the LAN, you had very poor connectivity. So the desktop became all powerful, and you had so much RAM on the desktop, you were only exchanging bits of data. But today, we've gone back to the world of web services because we have enough bandwidth, and we take the bandwidth as a given. So we don't have to load the desktop, so we use Google Docs. And so you could see that as well. As the networks, so in a world where 4G is widespread, and you have very high-speed internet connectivity at a reasonable cost available, then we might not want to overload the phone with lots of apps, because it would be very easy to get those off the web. So I think that's the other side of that equation. And again, it's hard to put a timeline on some of that. Any other questions? My email address is there, so by all means, feel free to drop me a line. I'm always happy to talk about this. So that should serve as a warning. All right, if there are no questions, thank you very much.